Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Deborah Silameo, a member of the Board of Governors of the club and president of the Silameo Group. I'm filling in today for National Press Club President Lisa Matthews. Thank you all for joining us for this Headliners Newsmaker with Dr. Sudip Parikh, who's the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We're happy to accept your questions during the program, and I will ask as many as we have time for. If you want to submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. Now, science is at the core of almost every major issue facing our nation and the world today. The role of science, its future path, its funding levels, its value are being debated at all levels of government, in the private sector, in educational institutions, and among all of us personally. Journalists, especially, and consumers of news are hungry for authentic, trusted sources of information about science and technology advances and what they mean for us. As President Biden prepares to release his first budget, he has said that he will ask Congress to return federal science spending to at least 2% of the gross domestic product. That could be very good news for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who has members from 91 countries around the world and a mission to advance science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people. Dr. Parikh is the Chief Executive Officer of AAAS and Executive Publisher of the Science family of journals. He has devoted his career to science and public policy, and he knows quite a bit about budgets too. For 8 years, he served as science advisor and professional staff to the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee. It's also worth noting for our audience today that Dr. Parikh first studied journalism before switching his major to materials science and ultimately earning a PhD in macromolecular structure and chemistry. We are very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say about President Biden's budget request for science activities and where the US stands now in relation to its peers in global research and development, in STEM education and innovation. Please join me this morning in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Sudip Parikh. Dr. Parikh.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, and thank the National Press Club for inviting me today, particularly my friend Mike Fulton, who's a longtime friend. I feel really honored to do this, but I am really looking forward to the day when we can do this sort of thing in person again. I've even started to miss giving talks over the sound of forks and knives clinking, as opposed to my dogs barking and my kids fighting. So I do look forward to that day. Well, in my role, let's get started. In my role, I have the privilege of representing 120,000 scientists and engineers from every discipline, from agriculture and artificial intelligence to X-ray crystallography and zoology. And here's what they tell me. It seems really strange to say it during a pandemic, but we live in absolutely wondrous times of discovery. The pace of discovery and innovation has never been faster. We have seen the methane-covered mountains of Pluto, and they are beautiful. We have discovered gravitational ripples caused by colliding black holes across the galaxy. We've detailed, closer to home, we've detailed extensive changes to our climate and to our environment. We've advanced artificial intelligence and quantum computing to the brink of broader utility, and we've harnessed gene editing to potentially cure sickle cell anemia and other diseases. And I said the word cure. We didn't used to say that word very much in the sciences. Despite the failures in our public health response to the pandemic, the biomedical research enterprise has never worked more quickly. Science is going to be essential to solving this societal challenge. But these achievements, these amazing achievements, are lagging indicators of our past investments in science and technology. They're lagging indicators. Many comments have been made about the overnight success of the mRNA vaccines from Moderna and BioNTech Pfizer, but there's a 30-year story behind that overnight success. And I think that's illustrative of why investing in science and technology is critical to the future. The mRNA vaccines had many key contributors. Barney Graham and Kizzmekia Corbett at NIH come to mind. Scientists at Moderna and BioNTech come to mind. The financiers who kept these small companies going certainly had a role. But I'd like to add one more. And the key contributor I'd like to add is the US Congress, because they doubled the NIH budget from 1999 to 2003. And then they provided a $10 billion stimulus in 2009 and 10. And those were key times when funding was flowing to higher risk research. And so if we take a look at this slide, this is the paper by Catalin Carrico and Drew Weissman that described the basic research that made the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine platforms possible. This is it. This is the seminal piece of research that went relatively unnoticed at the time, because a lot of times seminal pieces of research do go unnoticed. The research, if you look down there at the bottom, was funded by NIH grants, National Institutes of Health grants, that were first awarded during the 1999 to 2003 doubling of the NIH. At that time, 1 in every 3 approved proposals were funded, and that enabled riskier projects to receive funding. Today, less than 1 in 5 approved proposals receive funding, and it's harder to get riskier things funded. I would say the mRNA vaccines are a product of doubling our investment in the NIH. They're also a lagging indicator of that investment, and I would also say they're an embodiment of our wondrous times. But we also live in uncertain times. There are multiple intersecting challenges that have the potential, any one of them have the potential, to become the next global crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic is not going to be the last time that science and scientists are going to be called upon to mitigate an existential threat. We're going to be addressing other public health concerns, such as Alzheimer's. We've got to work on climate change, food and water insecurity, and other challenges, many of which have yet to emerge. We've also got to ensure our economic vitality, including good jobs. And that's going to require new investments, new expansion of science and technology, just like that doubling of the NIH. We shouldn't make any mistake. We are in 2 high-stakes global competitions. First, we're racing China, India, Europe, friends and not, to discover and translate scientific advances into products and services that provide jobs, good jobs, and build our future economy. Second, we're also in a race against time to make the discoveries, invent the technologies, and develop the practices to mitigate the upcoming crises. If you look at this slide, there have been numerous calls to action to address the societal challenges and to keep up with our competition. And these calls have grown steadier and louder over the last decade. There's 2 here just from the last 6 months. The one on the left, The Perils of Complacency, was chaired by Norm Augustine, the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, and Neil Lane, the former science advisor to President Clinton. Then the one in the middle here is chaired by Mary Woolley of Research America and Keith Yamamoto of UCSF and myself. And we call this the Science and Technology Action Committee. And you can tell by that name that we are definitely scientists and not marketers. But our message was so clear and pulled upon so many other reports and calls to action over the last decade that we really just had 3 recommendations. The first was to elevate the science advisor of the cabinet. Everything involves science today, science and technology. We needed the science advisor in the cabinet. I'm really excited to say that has happened. The second was to provide authority and dollars for the science advisor to coordinate action by the 20+ federal agencies that do research. If you're going to attack climate change, or you're going to attack batteries or energy storage and other things, you've got to have coordinated activities. And then the third, and really important, is to substantially increase federal investment in science and technology. From the low point where it is today, which is about 0.7% of GDP, to at least 1.4% of GDP as soon as possible. The elevated leadership, the coordination of activities, and the funding increases would enable us to try new funding models. and develop new development pathways, to tackle the big problems of our time that we just talked about. This wouldn't be your father's S&T enterprise plodding along. Now, as I said, calls like this have come before, but we're at an inflection point. Our business community and political decision makers are joining this call to action. As you can see from this slide, the Council on Competitiveness, the Chamber of Commerce, they've both made forceful statements in favor of growing our investment in science and technology. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, and Republican Senator Todd Young last year introduced legislation for a dramatic increase in National Science Foundation funding and scope. The House Science Committee, chaired by Eddie Bernice Johnson, has introduced bipartisan legislation to double funding for the National Science Foundation. The House Republican leadership, let me say that again, the House Republican leadership called for doubling basic research. And the House Science Committee ranking member, Frank Lucas, has backed that up with a bill to do so. And there are many, many more examples of this call to action coming from our political leaders. Perhaps most relevant for today, the president clearly stated that he wants to see federal research and development investment substantially higher, closer to that 2% of GDP number that we've mentioned, and that's been recommended by the S&T Action Committee, the Council on Competitiveness, and many others. Well, President Biden's call to action is made manifest in the American Jobs Plan, and hopefully, and I say hopefully, in the upcoming president's budget request. So I thought we could dig into that a little bit in terms of the science and technology components of the American Jobs Plan. Now, let me caveat this by saying there's not yet any legislative language, so details are a little scarce. But let's start with the big picture. The plan proposes roughly $250 billion for research and development over 8 years. When you consider that the annual budget contains over $150 billion for R&D every year, it makes that number within the American Jobs Plan seem a bit smaller in the grand scheme of things. Now, I want you to keep in mind that this chart is really back of the envelope because we don't have details, but it is really illustrative because the top line numbers are about, they're about right. Now, this is the total federal research and development outlays as a share of GDP. We call this research intensity. You can see that over the last 60 years, we've witnessed a steady decline in federal R&D intensity. Now, if you look ahead, the dashed areas of these curves, if we funded research and development at a flat rate without taking inflation into account, you see that decline continue. If funding is allocated at the historical average growth, you can see that R&D intensity begins to plateau. Now, if we just make a really simple assumption and say that the amount of funding for research and development in the American Jobs Plan will go out spread over evenly across the next 8 years, it adds that boost to the scenario. It's that ladder scenario. What you do see is at the end of that 8 years, it goes back down. You also see that in terms of approaching the president's goal of 2% of GDP, it doesn't move the needle much. It's definitely large, but the base budget is much more crucial to the overall R&D spending outlook. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing that come out hopefully this week. Now that said, for several specific programs in the American Jobs Plan, these numbers really are big. They're potentially transformative, and they're also perhaps transient. So let's run through those. In terms of actual research infrastructure, the buildings, the equipment, this is going to roughly double the current annual level of spending on that infrastructure, and that's really important. In terms of research and development that would spur job creation in rural areas, this would be a huge boost, a $30 billion boost over 8 years. That would be transformational. We need to make sure that there are scientific centers and scientific research is connected across the nation, not just on the East Coast and the West Coast, not just in Cambridge and Palo Alto. Those are wonderful places, but we also need to be in other places around the country. We've got to pull from our entire population. The National Science Foundation would see funding for a technology directorate that would focus on research into critical technologies of the future, AI, quantum science, advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity. This really dovetails with two pieces of authorizing legislation that are making their way through the House and the Senate right now, the Endless Frontier Act and then the NSF reauthorization in the House. Both of those are going sort of in this direction. The key here is that our R&D budget and policy program here at AAAS estimates that the Biden plan would equate to annual increases of over 25% per year for the National Science Foundation for the next 5 years. That'd be outside the annual approach process. That is transformational. That is also aimed at not just the basic research, improving and growing that as well, but also seeing it translated into technologies and products that drive the economy. The semiconductor research would see $50 billion for research and manufacturing through the CHIPS Act. This is incredibly important for competitiveness. The package would also be, and this is really important, transformative for our HBCUs, our historically Black colleges and universities, and our minority serving institutions. This would amount, the dollars in the American Jobs Plan would amount to a 10 times increase, not 10%, 10 times increase in annual support. That would be transformational. And look, investments like these are going to be vital to securing American competitiveness in an increasingly global competition. If we're going to compete with the demographic behemoths that are China and India, we're going to need the brain power of the descendants of Native Americans, of pilgrims, of founding mothers and fathers, enslaved people, Ellis Island arrivals, and immigrants from everywhere. We're going to need all of them, and we're going to need the orthogonal thinking and creative boost that comes from diverse teams. We're not going to compete in terms of gross numbers of scientists and engineers. We don't have the population for it. So there's a lot in terms of science and technology to like in the proposed plan. But we got to remember that this is a one-time investment package. It would turbocharge certain areas that I mentioned, but securing long-term competitiveness and reaping the rewards for all Americans is going to be a multi-year endeavor and can't rely on one or two big packages. And that's why it's crucial. It's crucial that the forthcoming budget request and the Congress set us on a steady and sustainable long-term path. And since the president's on the record talking about trying to get closer to that intensity peak in his FY22 budget, let's put some numbers on this for context. So in this slide, we're going to look at what it would take to get back to the 1.9% of GDP research intensity peak. With 30% annual growth, we could return by 2026. With 10% annual growth, we could return by 2040. Somewhere in between is probably best. But for context, we've averaged 5% annually for the past few decades. So with these investments, we could put new and significant funding into key research areas. We could diversify our funding portfolio with some higher risk, higher reward research without having to rob existing successful funding models. We could fix long-standing structural issues to ensure that we are leveraging our greatest asset, our diverse people. But to put a 15% per year increase into context, it would require $24 billion in additional discretionary spending in FY22 alone. Now, as a former appropriations staffer, I've got no delusions that the bipartisan voices of support make this a given or even easy. The first step is the president's budget request, and we're hearing it's going to include expansive support for R&D. That's great. But Congress has the real power of the purse. And the budget resolution will need to provide sufficient discretionary spending authority, 302As for those who speak budget, to enable increases of around 15% a year for S&T, about $24 billion in FY22. Then the appropriators are going to need to apply that spending authority to individual appropriations bills. That's 302Bs for my fellow budget geeks out there, such that the 20 plus agencies that do research actually get funding. And then authorizers are going to need to inform these plus-ups with authorizing legislation like the Endless Frontier Act, the CHIPS Act, the NSF reauthorization, broadband for all, climate legislation. There's a lot of work to be done on the authorizing side. This requires the action of the president and literally dozens of senators and representatives. Now, in a normal time, I would consider that a weakness, but these aren't normal times. Leaders from across business, academia, finance, and the political spectrum have recognized this global competition that we're facing from many countries, including even our friends. They've recognized the scientific opportunities that are sitting in front of us to improve the health and financial well-being of all Americans. many of these opportunities have been created by us. So political leaders who disagree on almost everything else find common ground here. But we've got to get past political paralysis. And just as success will be claimed by all, the failure will result in finger pointing in every direction. But this time, different than any other time in my 22 years in DC, everyone has said they're on board. And it'll be easy to spot where the failure occurred because we know the choke points. So it is my hope and expectation that they're better angels and that political reality will lead to action. Now, I started by noting that the seminal research that enabled the development of the mRNA vaccines was conducted 20 years ago during that period of expansion at the NIH. Now, we're a nation that, despite all of our imperfections and cacophony of voices, we vaccinated 4.1 million Americans on Friday and another 4.1 million on Saturday. That's over 1.1% of our population in a single day. That's unbelievable. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. The question is not, can we make these investments? It's will we? It'll be messy, it'll be imperfect, but let's not miss this moment. And so it leads me to this one final thought, which is, I wonder what unnoticed piece of research that's going on right now will inspire awe, save lives, and grow our economy for everyone over the next 20 years, the same way that that paper did that I showed you at the beginning. But then I also wonder, is that research happening in the United States? And I certainly hope it is. And with that, I will end, and I look forward to having a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. You have given us a lot to unpack. And I do want to just step back for 1 second and talk about, we've been underfunding in your perspective for a long time. And I believe that we have lost some standing in the eyes of other countries with respect to US leadership and investment in science and technology. I'm wondering how you've seen this changed, our standing in the world, and whether or not, because of that, other countries perhaps have been poaching some of our best and our brightest researchers and intellectual property and so forth. So, there's sort of a people issue and a funding issue.
Deborah, it's a terrific question. It's so important. Look, I want to be really honest and frank to say that there are many areas in which the United States remains the leader in the sciences. That is true. The challenge here is the trend lines are not good. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we have stayed relatively steady in terms of our patents, our publications, which are sort of the metrics. They're not perfect metrics, they're metrics of research. Other nations have been investing heavily. They've seen our model. Right? Our model's been around for 75 years. They've seen our model. They've copied it. They get it. It works. And so they've seen that model. And so now, today, in terms of overall publications of research, China has surpassed us. Now, have they surpassed us in terms of publications that are the most impactful? Not yet, but in some areas they are very close, and in some areas they're even ahead. And so we've got to be really careful. We've got to know that we can't just stand still. The world is not standing still around us. What's that meant for our young researchers? It's meant that, yes, we have been a crossroads of scientists for 50 years, 75 years. We bring the best and brightest here because they are attracted by the enterprise that is here and the opportunity to make a change and to make impact. Now, if you see that opportunity in other places, we lose some of those people who are willing to come here. We also lose people from the United States who are willing to go to Europe, who are willing to go to China and learn there as well. Science is a global activity, and it should be a global activity. But we want to make sure that we're a crossroads for that activity, and we're no longer the only player. And that's a scary place to be. We need that homegrown talent. We need talent from around the world, and it starts with, is the enterprise strong? And it's no longer alone in the world.
And you mentioned that there's some funding to increase the diversity of the scientific community, the funding for HBCUs and so forth. Do you see that as, is there more we can do? To encourage women in the STEM fields, to encourage diversity?
Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. The sciences are they're a reflection of our society. So, the challenges that confront our society, they make their way into our homes, our places of worship, and into our work settings, including the sciences. And so when we look at the diversity of the sciences in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, it's not always a reflection of America. Now, there are some really interesting trends there. If you look at the biological and the life sciences, we actually have more women graduates in those fields than we do men. But as you get higher and higher along the ladder, getting to full professors and the sort of leaders in academia and in the industry, the women start to diminish in terms of the numbers. So that by the time you get to the top, it's completely inverted. We see this remarkable diversity in our junior faculty, in the graduate students, and we want to make sure that we're providing pathways for those younger scientists where all of that wonderful diversity and orthogonal thinking makes its way into the more senior positions. What can we be doing? We need to be able to make this normative. So make it part of our thought processes, not interventions, right? It's always nice to put a Band-Aid on something and say, yes, we could have a program that will cluster hire 3 women into our faculty or 3 minorities into our faculty or into our industry. That is a Band-Aid. It's helpful. It helps a bit. We need to make it normative. We need to make these processes normative. And part of that is by seeing a workforce that is just brimming with talent. And right now, if you're a minority student, if you're a first generation student, I don't care what race you are or what gender you are, if you're a first generation student and you graduated, you're the first in your family to go to college, why in the world would you go into the sciences? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you, the pay is not great for a graduate student. It's not great for a postdoc when you're 30 years old. Why wouldn't you go into medical school or go into be a lawyer or go be an engineer or go be heaven forbid, a financier? Why wouldn't you do that? And why wouldn't your parents tell you to do that? So we've got to make it a more attractive field. And part of that is by showing that there's a future, showing that there is a path. And this kind of investment, particularly in the HBCUs and the minority serving institutions, shows that there is a path. So we can get some of those first generation students. We need that thinking, because again, China and India are going to graduate more STEM graduates than we are. There's no way around that. There's just too many more people there. But what we have is we have this diversity of voices that comes from a diversity of experiences. And that leads to these creative teams such that we have a person, I showed you that work, that Hungarian woman immigrant who came to America and was doing that work at Penn brought a different way of thinking. Many scientists told her that wouldn't work, which is why I think that someday, I talked about it being a seminal piece of research. I think we all think she's going to win a Nobel Prize someday for doing that, for sticking with it. But that comes from a diversity of thought, and we're so fortunate to have it. Let's make sure that we're feeding it.
You mentioned that COVID is just one of the scientific issues that we are dealing with now and will have to deal with in the future. And you saw some other ones coming up on the horizon. Do you feel, I probably shouldn't say, are we prepared? Are we even preparing to address those challenges?
We are. Look, there are scientists working in almost every field. The question is, are we doing it in a way that we're applying the right resources to the right problems? So what you see in the American Jobs Plan is this focus on climate research. And that is, it's an area where there's certainly research ongoing, but it lacks some coordination. It lacks necessarily a big picture plan, whole of government plan. It lacks coordination with the private sector in a big way. And so we can imagine that we should be coordinating these activities at the federal level. So one of the recommendations I talked about for that science advisor is to give that person some dollars, some resources to help coordinate, to help create national plans for energy storage. If we're going to use technologies that are greener, we're going to need energy storage. We're also going to need batteries for cars and other electric vehicles that are more efficient than the ones today. We need to have a national plan for that. Not because plans are the end all and be all. There's hopefully some wonderful scientists working behind the scenes right now that 20 years from now will deliver something really important to us. But plan beats no plan most of the time. And most of our competitors have plans. They have plans in these areas. And we're starting to see some of that, right? So in quantum, we've seen some of that. In semiconductors, we've seen some of that. We've got to pull that together and really be forceful about it, thoughtful about it at the highest levels of government and industry. And that's the White House. That's not sitting 3 layers deep in an agency or in an uncoordinated fashion with philanthropy and industry.
There's a question related to what you just said, and I want to build upon it. What do you see as the significance of having the president's science advisor assume a seat on the cabinet? How do we ensure the new role can actually have an impact on our federal science enterprise? And a related question that I had is, I think you're talking about someone who is coordinating, not necessarily consolidating the agencies, because after 9/11, we had the Homeland Security model where we tried to actually, what we did, pull everything into one agency for better or worse. So sort of answer the question from our viewer, but also how this differs from the approach.
Oh, no, thank you for bringing that up, Deborah. I think it's really important. Let me just start with there. I'm definitely not advocating a Department of Science. That decentralized nature of our scientific enterprise is actually wonderful. What it means is that there's a diversity of thought there, right? That there are people in NOAA thinking about this, also in the Department of Defense thinking about this, and also in the USDA thinking about climate change. And that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. What is the significance of having the science advisor at the cabinet? A couple of things. One is that you can't you can't answer the big questions of today without seeing how they relate to science and technology. You just can't. You can't have a true discussion about housing without thinking about what the role the environment plays in where housing gets placed. You can't have a discussion about defense without thinking about the ways that S&P plays into defense. And so having the science advisor at the cabinet is the first step in at least bringing the scientific voice to that table. But we have to be really careful and not over congratulate ourselves on this, because if Eric Lander is confirmed, he'll be sitting at a table that includes the Secretary of HHS, who has over $1 trillion in budget. He'll be sitting next to the Secretary of Defense, who has over $700 billion in budget. And the budget for the Office of Science and Technology Policy is $5.5 million with an M dollars. So no matter how wonderful the arguments, how powerful the personality, without resources, it's very hard to make an impact at that table. You might get your phone call answered. And so one of the things I think is really important is that there be some money, not a consolidation of agencies, but rather enough money to consolidate and to incentivize agencies to work together. And so, if it was an amount that right now what happens is that the policy advisor goes around and asks for money from different agencies, puts together $40 million and says, okay, let's all work together. If we could just turn that around, if there were $40 million that he or she had, that they could say, let's incentivize working together on this plan because we have the dollars and the resources to make it happen. That will make an impact, and that would enable us to apply scientific thinking in these realms outside of necessarily the science agencies. Think of the census. The census has so much in terms of math, in terms of statistics, that is required in terms of demographics and the social sciences. We need to make sure that the Secretary of Commerce is having a conversation with a science advisor.
It occurs to me, especially, the membership of the Press Club, journalists and communicators, that part of this is helping the public understand the value here and the importance and what it means to them to, in turn, influence the policymakers. So do you have suggestions? Well, first of all, do reporters really have the access to the information they need to understand what's happening? And do you have suggestions for the improvement of journalistic coverage, or even sort of the PR, if you will, around the importance of the funding and research you're talking about?
Yeah, it's tough, Deborah. You mentioned that I wanted to be a journalist when I first got to college. I grew up in North Carolina, and so I wanted to be the next Charles Kuralt, which tells you something, because a guy named Sudip Parikh wanted to be the next Charles Kuralt. That didn't work out, but the respect that I have for communicators is incredibly high. And we as scientists haven't always done a good job. We're sometimes the worst communicators of our own work, because we tend to get deep into jargon really quickly. We tend to really want to talk about the details and the granularity. When we, as scientists, make that mistake, we hurt the cause. Part of what we've got to do is train this next generation. I see scientists under 35 who want to be communicators, in addition to being excellent in their sciences. And that is wonderful. What we've always had scientists who, after they've won their Nobel Prize or after they've become a full professor, they've become science communicators, and they're very good at it. But we have a generation now that's ready. They want to do this. And frankly, we've democratized this conversation. So general beat reporters that are based in Houston or in Omaha or in Hickory, North Carolina, my hometown, they should be able to have a conversation with a scientist that's local. Because what's happened is, when you have this remove between scientists and who we're working for, the American people, then you get this lack of trust. So, for example, with the vaccine, anybody who knows scientists who work in a university town or who work around these companies, they know people that work in this area. They say, I trust that person. I may not know the science, but I trust that person. I think this is a good idea to take this vaccine. If you've never met a scientist, if you've never seen one participate in your community, then you have a very hard time building trust. I get it. I get that. We've got to make sure that we as scientists are participating in our communities. And that also means participating with journalists. At the AAAS, we've created a program, two programs. One's the Mass Media Fellowships, where we place scientists in newsrooms around the country, not just at the Washington Post, but also at smaller newspapers around the country. We also have a program called Sciline, where general beat reporters and other reporters can contact us on deadline, and we will connect them with a local scientist, if at all possible, in whatever area they want to talk about. So they can have a timely discussion for a quote for information. We've got to be good at that. We've got to be much more timely at that. We got to work on journalism time, which nowadays is much faster, even for you all, and much slower. We work at a much slower pace in academia.
Talking about some confusion that people might have, I think that the vaccine is one where there was a little bit of confusion about, well, who paid for the research? Why shouldn't the companies do more? They're making the profits. Can you help us unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. I showed you that slide that had the paper that I told you is the seminal work in terms of making these platforms possible. And so sometimes people ask, well, gosh, if that was paid for by the NIH, why do we have to pay for these medicines? Why do we have to pay for the vaccines? That seminal piece of research was incredibly important, but there are many more steps getting from that seminal piece of research to the platforms that are out there today. And so there is just an incredible amount of investment. There has to be a handoff. There has to be a handoff from the federally funded research that takes place into industry and the private sector that then take a lot of risks, because nothing said at that moment that was going to work. Just as that was one piece of seminal work, there were thousands of other pieces of research like that also had the same possibilities. And I couldn't have told you at the time which one was going to be the one. And so industry and investors took chances. They took risks. Some of them failed. Some of them succeeded. And it turns out that piece was seminal, which is wonderful. Turn it around the other way. Why shouldn't industry be doing that kind of research? It's really hard. It's really hard because, again, you don't know which of those thousands of pieces of research are going to be the ones that are going to make it all the way through the processes. And so government does a lot of de-risking. We do a lot of investment ahead of time. You need this portfolio of investment, right? Just like you have a stock portfolio. I hope, most of us we have a diverse portfolio. We invest some things that are high risk, some things that are T-bills. We want to sort of have that diversity so that we can weather the good times and the bad times. Research is similar. When we make investments, we need to be able to make investments that are very, very risky and maybe game changing. Then we've also got some incremental work, lots of incremental work that is really important to do. And we have to have that basket of risk taking. And that goes from government to philanthropy to industry. And we've built a wonderful ecosystem here in the United States. Let's make sure that we nurture
it. I think that, and this may be overly simplistic, but there are things that we all use and appreciate every day that we don't understand came out of research that was originally funded by the government. And, I'm not sure, how we can improve the understanding of that, but to make people see that the investment, what the end result is in terms of improving their lives.
It's a really hard connection to make. People always point to their phones, right? They always point to their phones. There's some wonderful fact sheets out there about all the different pieces of federal investment that went into making your iPhone or your Galaxy phone. I'd encourage folks to take a look at those. It's mind-boggling what's been made possible by the American people's investment in research and development, and in turn, hopefully the economic benefit that they get out of it.
Here's a question for you. What do you think of NASA's transition to a private sector model? Tell us from a scientific perspective the pluses and minuses. Is NASA's model worthy of replicating by any other agencies?
It's a fascinating question, and it's one where we're in the midst of this kind of giant experiment, aren't we? There's a wonderful interview with Elon Musk from about 10 years ago where he was asked about some criticism that he took from Apollo era astronauts in the vision for what SpaceX was doing. He gets a little bit emotional, and he says that, I believe in what I'm doing, and those are my heroes, but I believe in what I'm doing. That's been the mark of people who sort of move the ball down the field. Agree with them or disagree with them, they have moved the ball down the field at SpaceX and other private space ventures. The model of having both of these working in parallel is probably unsustainable in the long run in terms of government funding both, but it's a great place to be right now. We've sort of hedged our bets. We have some of the work going internally inside of NASA with Artemis and the development going there. We have work going on outside in the commercial sector. At some point, there'll be some decision making about, okay, which path is going to be the right one and the best one and the most efficient one, the most cost effective one to get us into space. And maybe it'll be that it's all of the above. It just requires investment from outside the federal government. It's an exciting time. It's a truly exciting time. In terms of space, we're talking about going back to the moon. We're talking about going to Mars, and it's not just talk. It's not just talk. There's real investment being made in both the federal programs and in the commercial sector. I do hope that over time we start to see that strategy winnow down. But at the moment, it's good to see the breadth and diversity of it.
It's another one of those, time will tell.
Exactly. Time will tell. But it certainly has moved the ball faster than what we were doing 10 years ago at the end of the shuttle era, right? And I think that's really telling, is that we are more excited today about space and what's possible there, both commercially and from a discovery perspective, than we were 10 years ago. And that's exciting to me.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned a little bit about partisanship, and you did work on Capitol Hill for the Senate Appropriations Committee. Tell us about that experience and what it meant to you in terms of, what the work you're doing now, but also what's different today, what remains the same. I mean, it seems like even if there's some bipartisan agreement on the need to increase funding, that doesn't necessarily translate into action.
Oh, you're so right. Deborah, I worked worked on Senator probes between 2001 and 2009. And, at that time, oftentimes, people talked about the Democrats, the Republicans, and the appropriators. Bills came out of committee with unanimous support, and that was, we took it a little bit for granted at the time, and it's certainly not the case today. I came out of my time on the Hill in 2009. I came out of it less cynical than when I went in, because for all the really loud arguments that are happening on the outside, remember that those appropriations bills are, they're thick documents, right? The bill language is 150 pages. There's a lot in there. 90% of it is worked out between the executive branch and the Congress without anybody worrying about it, because it's good policy. And that's really wonderful to see. There's 10% of it that we argue about really loudly. Now, the worrisome part is when that 10% gets in the way of the other 90% actually becoming law. And that's what's happened over the last few years. And it's incredibly worrying to me. And I am, I talked about the fact that this bipartisan support doesn't mean support for this is going to happen. It doesn't mean at all that we're going to see this increase in science and technology funding. I'm heartened to say, I saw I saw that the earmarks are part of the discussion again in the appropriations cycle. As a former appropriator, I can tell you that with the right checks and balances and with transparency, earmarks are a really powerful thing. They enable people to make compromises, and you get the support for bills that you might not have gotten otherwise. You have strong support for a bill because there's a bridge or a tunnel or a building that's going to be in your district or in your state. I hope that we can see a little bit of that again. Not in research. We don't want to earmark research. It's a bad idea. We need to make sure that we're doing that in an investigator-initiated, peer-reviewed way. But in terms of being able to show some progress for your constituents, it makes a huge difference. And I hope that it's not just in terms of earmarks, but in terms of real policy progress, showing that a national science foundation that has additional dollars and can put a regional hub in your district or in your state, that's powerful, that's important. And frankly, it's worthwhile. They shouldn't all be on the East and West Coast. They shouldn't all be in existing parts of the hierarchy. We need churn. We need churn in that ecosystem. So I'm excited. Politics is part of what we have to do in a free society. I'm excited that scientists are feeling more empowered to engage. We've got some opportunity here, and I'm hoping they will.
And I assume you're in conversations with them.
We certainly are. And we're excited because members on both sides of the aisle have been asking us to talk about what should be, what is the right policy in some of these bills. And that's really terrific to see. There's momentum there. It doesn't mean there could be passage, because they have to agree on something at the top. And so I'm really hoping, again, that the fact that everybody's watching makes it to where people find ways to find common ground, particularly in the sciences, to make these increases possible. Otherwise, we're going to lose ground. We're going to lose ground to our competitors. We're going to lose ground to these existential threats that are out there.
All right, I am going to read this question. Many of the most eminent naturalists of the 19th century were strong proponents of the biological theory of design. In fact, Darwin himself theorized that the very first forms of life were the result of design. Today, however, AAAS seems to take the position that theorizing about design in nature is unscientific. Do you agree with this?
There are lots of data out there showing that the principles of evolution are what are driving life forward. AAAS, we publish science as peer-reviewed by other scientists. We define what is the consensus of many scientists. We are open to any form of science that can be peer-reviewed, stand up to criticism, and make its way through the process. What we don't do is suggest that in teaching students that they be taught something that doesn't yet have any evidence behind it. And so as long as things have evidence behind them, and that it's evidence that is peer-reviewed, is part of the scientific process, that's important to support. But what we don't do is take something by assumption. So I hope that answers the question. These are the kinds of questions that we want to make sure that we are engaging at the right level. And what I mean by that is, let's make sure that we're engaging at the level of how do we actually move the sciences forward for students who've then got to go out into the world and develop new vaccines, develop the drugs that are going to cure Alzheimer's. I want more than anything a drug that's going to cure Alzheimer's, because I see this avalanche that's coming economically and in terms of care. Well, if we're teaching our students science that has evidence behind it, wherever that evidence takes them, then they are going to be better equipped to go out and do that research to cure Alzheimer's. Because the number one thing I want is a cure for Alzheimer's. Number two thing I want is for it to be here in the United States. I want it to be developed here because I want to see the economic impact that comes from that. I want to see the morale boost that comes from that happen here in the United States. And so I want to make sure that our kids are getting an education that enables that.
That's it. That takes me into another thing. Are there recommendations? I mean, we have now we have some standards, next generation science standards, but we see that when we have national assessments that kids sort of continuously don't do very well when it comes to understanding science. There was some encouraging data that came out recently, which showed that when we were talking about science and engineering literacy, girls actually did as well as boys. And I don't know whether the literacy component of it had the impact there, but can we do more to engage kids earlier in the process so they are thinking of these careers and just learning the principles that they need to understand the world around them?
We've got to do more at an earlier age. So much of this is signaling to children that we almost don't even think about. When we say, "Oh, you're good at that," it's amazing how a 6-year-old picks up on that, or a 7-year-old picks up on that. I've been talking to a person named Kenneth Hill in Chicago. He's been running a program on the south side of Chicago, teaching kids, getting them ready for careers in the sciences and in engineering. And it's so much about that elementary school age, about getting girls and young children to see that they are good at the sciences and good at math, because the signals mean everything. It's also giving them the background and the curriculum, but just the signaling, saying that you are good at this, means such a big makes such a difference for getting them to continue in these paths. I had a wonderful conversation with the chair of the National Science Board, Ellen Ochoa, who is an astronaut and just a remarkable scientist. And she was mentioning that she was interested as a young girl in math and physics and in the sciences. And so she wrote to and talked to 2 different professors about this. And one sort of blew her off, and the other one said, "Oh yes, you should do this work." And so she chose that field, right? That one interaction made all the difference in terms of which field she chose. Now, it worked out great for Ellen. She has the ability to start a conversation by saying, "On my second trip to space," which I don't think many people get to say. So it all worked out really well for her. But what if that second teacher hadn't encouraged her? What if that hadn't happened, right? And that's the kind of everyday interaction that we have. We want to make sure that our kids are seeing not just that they're good at science, but there's a path in the science.
Do you talk to students?
I do, every chance I get. Believe me, that's much, Deborah. That's not in any way trying to criticize the NPC. I love talking to journalists as well. But give me a bunch of 12-year-olds. They are exciting. They make me feel good about the world, and they show me that everybody is born a scientist. We drub it out of them. But everybody's born a scientist.
That's great. I think we are coming up on time, so I'm going to take care of some housekeeping here before I ask you the last question. Let's see. Now, I want to thank everyone who was involved, first of all, in producing this program today. That is the Headliners co-team, Dinah Linewine and Lori Russo. And the person who, as you mentioned earlier, coordinated today's event, Mike Fulton, and Club Communications Director, Lindsay Underwood, who does so much, including help produce these programs. And of course, our Executive Director, Bill McCarran. I'd also like to tell you about some upcoming headliners. It is actually Science Week here at the National Press Club, because tomorrow at 2 p.m., we're going to hear on the latest of COVID and vaccines from Dr. Anthony Fauci. And then next Monday, April 12th, we're going to hear from Washington Post reporter John Woodrow Cox, who is the author of Children Under Fire, An American Crisis. And that is on the impact of gun violence on children in America. And then Tuesday, April 13th, we're going to hear from award-winning CBS journalist Marvin Kell, who will share the second volume of his personal memoirs, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. So lots of good stuff coming up. And now a final question for you. So I'm intrigued by the fact that you studied journalism before you switched to science, and we sometimes think of those as sort of right brain, left brain functions. I'm wondering, why did you study it? Why did you leave it? Has it helped you, having studied it, in your work today?
Yeah. Oh, Deborah, the reason why I got interested in journalism is because I felt like there were relatively few ways to influence the future. But I felt like journalism was one of those ways. I felt like if you could tell a story, if you could research something deeply and tell a story about it, that you could change the way that people feel about something. And the data is important. The data is important. The way, you know, the feeling that you get from reading an excellent piece of journalism that has both informed you, but then also has perhaps given you a nugget of information that is changing just slightly your point of view, what you bring to the table. You've influenced the future. And to me, that was the exciting part. And, you know, Charles Kuralt had a very leisurely show on Sunday mornings, but it did that for us, right? It brought art to you. It brought other things to you in a way that I really appreciated. I changed because I was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and my journalism advisor kept asking me why I was taking calculus and why I was taking the second semester of calculus and then the third semester of calculus. And it brought to mind that, in fact, maybe I had other interests as well. And so I dug deeper into those. I've never lost my appreciation for journalism, and it has helped me because it's taught me that as much as numbers matter, as much as being able to analyze those 302As and 302Bs of the budget process, as much as that matters, being able to tell the story of what's going to be possible in a future in which we invest so much more in science and technology for our children and our children's children, that story, that ability to affect the future, I still want to do that. I still want to do it, whether I'm a journalist or I'm a scientist. And so I have a lot of respect and admiration for those of you in the field. And I hope that you'll start engaging other scientists, because we've got to work together to make sure that we affect the future in the right way.
We are really delighted to have had you here today to talk about all these issues. And you mentioned earlier you can't wait to get back to speaking over clinking glasses and everything. We can't wait for that either. I do want people to know, though, that in the meantime, we do events virtually. In fact, if you want to know more about the many platforms that the Press Club's Broadcast Center offers, contact Brian Taylor, btaylor@press.org, and we'd love to share with you some more of that, because we're going to be in a virtual world for quite some time. So once again, thank you so very much. And thanks to everyone who helped make this program possible. And thanks to everyone who participated in the program today.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.